Yeah, that's fine, Matt.
Okay, we're now live, Chairman.
Thank you, and good evening to members of the public. Good evening to officers and councillors on the meeting this evening. Welcome to this meeting of the Environment and Sustainability Panel of the 17th of December 2020. This meeting is being held remotely in line with the provisions of the regulations recently introduced by the government to enable local government decision-making meetings to be held remotely. The meeting is being broadcast on the Council's YouTube channel. The meeting will also be available to view on the Council's YouTube channel afterwards. Councillors and officers taking part in the meeting are requested to mute their microphones. Please activate your microphones when invited to speak and turn the microphone off again when you have finished speaking. Visiting councillors, members of the public and officers not taking an active part in the meeting are requested to turn off their cameras until they are invited to speak. When speaking, speak clearly and slowly. Please indicate to speak by using the raise hand function. I am chair of the committee and I invite all members of the committee to confirm their attendance and to introduce themselves. And I will just give you an order in terms of alphabetical. That's Councillor Hazel first, then Councillor Chinningworth, then Councillor Dundas, Councillor Gocher, Councillor McCarthy, Councillor Scordis and Councillor Whitehead. So Councillor Hazel, please.
Yes, I can hear. Understood.
Thank you, Councillor Hazel from Shrub End Ward.
Councillor Peter Chillingworth, a Rural North Ward.
Good evening, Councillor Paul Dundas, representing Stanway Ward and substituting for Councillor Robert Davidson.
Councillor Mark Gocher, Castle Ward.
Good evening, Councillor Sam McCarthy, representing Shrub End Ward.
Councillor Lee Scordis, representing Old Heath Hive and Rowhedge.
Councillor Lorcan Whitehead, representing Newtown and Christchurch Ward.
Thank you all. And I also invite the key officers who will be speaking and taking part in this evening's meeting. We have Rory Doyle, Mandy Jones, who is soon to arrive, is in another meeting, as is Dan Gascoigne, Maggie Ibrahim, Ben Plummer, Rosie Tamfield, Robert Duran and Tracy Allen. So could you please introduce yourselves in that order?
Good evening, everybody. It's Rory Doyle. I'm the Assistant Director for Environment and I'm the Senior Management Team member supporting this, members meeting.
Maggie, please.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I'm Maggie Ibrahim, the Sustainability and Climate Change Manager. I'm delivering our commitments to zero carbon by 2030.
Hello, I'm Ben Plummer, Climate Emergency Officer.
Hi, I'm Rosa Tamfield. I'm the Group Manager for Neighbourhood Services and I'm presenting a paper this evening on the transition of our fleet.
Good evening, my name is Robert Doran. I'm the Coastal Borough Council Fleet and Depot Manager and I was partaking in the report for the transfer of the fleet over to electric vehicles. Apologies.
Hello, I'm Tracy Allen, Specialist and Contracts Manager, Neighbourhood Services. I'm also here for the fleet transition report.
Thank you all. Thanks for your introductions and hopefully when Mandy and Dan arrive and are willing to speak, they can introduce themselves then. And Lee Scordis, when you're finished your dinner, you can come onto the screen. So thank you. With the provisions of the Constitution around timing of breaks, this will apply to this meeting. If you as a panel member need to leave, just please let me know and put your screen on mute as well as your microphone. So an introduction to this panel, it's the Environment and Sustainability Panel, which explores the methods of conservation of natural habitats and biodiversity through adapting existing practices or creating new ecologically diverse environments. The panel encourages renewable energy generation and carbon footprint reduction in both the public and private spheres by examining air quality, water quality, plastic and waste reduction, and renewable energy generation. The panel monitors the progress and implementation of the Council's Climate Emergency Action Plan and regularly reports to Cabinet and full Council. So just to cover the substitutions on item 2, we have Councillor Hazel, who is substituting for Councillor Chapman, and Councillor Dundas, who is substituting for Councillor Davidson. Item 3, urgent items, we have none. Item 4, declarations of interest. I invite panel members to declare any relevant interest that they have on tonight's agenda. Please indicate now. Okay, I see no hands up and no indications and nobody waving at me. Okay, thank you. Moving on then, item 5, the minutes of the previous meeting. Can I invite the panel to consensually agree that those minutes are a correct record? And please offer any dissent, or please inform me if they are incorrect and we will make the changes.
Agree.
Thank you, Peter. Councillor Chillingworth agrees. I see no dissent, so if we can agree in common then, thank you. I see some nods of those who were in attendance. So thank you. We can agree those minutes from the last meeting. And we can move on to item 6, have your say, which I believe there are no public speakers for this meeting. Can I just confirm, Matthew?
No, that's correct, Chair. No members of the public are in attendance this evening.
Thank you. We are talking further about engagement as we go along. We need to obviously encourage more, but we will be going out with types of engagement to the public and getting feedback that way as well. Thank you. So moving to item 7. Colchester Borough Council greenhouse gas emissions 2019-20, and I invite Ben Plummer please to introduce the item, and then I invite panel members to come in with comments. So Ben, please.
Yeah, I'll just bring up my screen to look at the report. Just to note, so this report is on Colchester Borough Council's greenhouse gas emissions for 2019-20, and is also sort of a segue into mentioning about a new carbon management plan, which will be starting next year, just sort of the principles of that. And we've got the Carbon Trust on the call today, David Riley from the Carbon Trust, will be helping us to produce that carbon management plan. So if you have any specific questions or requests that you'd like to see in that carbon management plan going forward, he's on the call, he can take those notes for you. Yes, so this is just a summary of our emissions for 2019-20. So I'll just go down to the main report. So firstly, we thought it'd be a reminder for councillors about what the council records as its emissions. We record it according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is a framework for measuring emissions from a variety of organisations. These are broken down into what they call Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3, which are explained on there. And if anyone has any questions about what they are, we can discuss those afterwards. But for the council's target of becoming carbon neutral, net zero, by 2030, we've included a variety of emission sources within that target. That includes elements of Scope 3 as well as all of Scope 1 and Scope 2. So these are represented in the pie chart and table below. So this compares it to last year's 2018-19's emissions with 2019-20. And just a quick, so there's a couple of things that need changing in this report. So on 5.3, the second sentence where it says emissions have decreased by 224 tonnes of CO2 equivalent, that is wrong. It's actually 351.4. It's basically the difference between these two bold numbers in the two tables there. It's just a miscalculation there. And much of that reduction has actually come from reduction in electricity consumption in council operations, but also because of the decarbonisation of the electricity grid. So 41.8% of the reduction in emissions associated with electricity consumption has come from a greening of the grid, so more renewable energy generation going into the grid. And the other notable change since last year worth pointing out is the increase in waste emissions from 43.4 to 90.9. The main reason for that is that we managed to source more data from additional council buildings this year, which put that up. Notable ones include the Town Hall, Grinstead Housing Office, Lion Walk Day Centre, and 2 of the council's car parks. And the biggest contributors are the same as previous years. Electricity and gas consumption are the main sort of 2 really in that. And then scope 3, which we measured for the first time this year for 2018-19, and now we've updated that for 2019-20. This is the change that needs to be made because an error was made in the calculation, and it refers to this procured goods and services line. These are calculated by in line with sort of what the Carbon Trust have advised. Is we take our top 10 contracts by monetary value that the council has each year for various activities, and there are sort of average emissions associated with the type of contract, the sector in which it is, and you multiply the sort of monetary value and combine that with the emission type to get the overall emissions for that. What these are have to change, so I'll note these down now and then explain why they're changing. So in 2018-19, the figure for procured goods and services, rather than being 12,868.7, it is actually 8,909.9. And for 2019-20, the same thing for procured goods and services, rather than 7,735.4, it should be 9,441.6. And the reason for that is that for the contracts we have to get annual monetary values for those contracts, and so some of the contracts run over like more than a year, so we have to like work out the annual values. What had been done was for one of the more significant contracts for 2018-19, we'd give it an annual value like it'd been running for 12 months, but it'd actually only been running since December 2018 to March 2019. So essentially we'd overestimated that, and that's why that figure's gone down for 2018-19. And for 2019-20, it was basically just the same thing, but kind of like in reverse. So we'd underestimated based on the fact that we'd given it a year for the previous, for 2018-19, we'd said it was a year. So that meant there was sort of less to include in 2019-20. But now that recalculation has been made, that has gone up. So in fact, as I mentioned in the report, it said that on 5.9, the main decrease was in that there isn't actually much of a decrease anymore. It's actually an increase. So basically not too much to note there. So moving on to the carbon management plan for next year. So the council had a carbon management plan for 2016 to 2020, and that's obviously running out this year. So we realised that we needed to put a new one in to identify new actions and projects that were going to cut carbon emissions and fit in with our climate emergency action plan. And we've decided to do that this year. We're speaking with the Carbon Trust for 3 years rather than previous plans, which have been 5 years. And that's to acknowledge a couple of things, really. For one, that technology is developing quite rapidly at the moment, and a lot of them, things might not be available now, but in a couple of years' time, it'd be good to have this plan as very adaptive and flexible so that we can incorporate those sort of beyond 2023. And also that we realised that a number of council assets are changing in their use post-COVID, and therefore we need to be adaptive and flexible about those assets and how we use them. So like previous carbon management plans, so from 2021 to 2023, we will establish key actions that we'll do between that time scale, identify when they will come in, the carbon emissions they will save, cost savings, and things along those sort of lines. And then beyond 2023, we'll basically have a trajectory of how we're going to reduce our carbon emissions to 2030. And a key part of the carbon management plan this year will be include some key milestone targets for reducing our emissions. So for 2023, we will set a target for reducing our emissions, sort of comparing it to the 2018-19 baseline. And then we'll set a number of other milestones for emission reductions as well, basically just to ensure that we're on target to reach net zero emissions by 2030. So we're acknowledging that it's quite a long time between the two, and we need to sort of break that down to make sure that we stay on target. And we're kind of happy for you to dictate where you want key milestones, which years you'd like milestones for, and help us with that. And alongside the plan also, we'll have a section on carbon emissions offsetting, as we acknowledge that it will be a part of the programme to reach net zero emissions, obviously be a last thing that we do, because we want to reduce our emissions as much as possible before doing that. But we'll look now to, for example, sort of best practice from other local authorities and also the private sector to inform how we do that going forward. So that's our sort of brief sort of principles for that carbon management plan. And we've fed some of those into the Carbon Trust, and any feedback from tonight will also feed into sort of the final brief or proposal for that, which will then be presented at the next Environment and Sustainability Panel meeting for your comment before we proceed with that. So that's the end of the report. I'm happy to take any comments from there.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you for updating us on those corrections that are needed to be made. With the carbon management plan, I've seen part of the old one when I was on Cabinet first, and the most recent one as well, how we've done a very good job implementing big reductions in CO2 emissions. And I think it's clear it gets harder and harder the more that you do and the less that you have to change. And we have sort of outdated practices, I suppose, that are linked mainly to our buildings. So the one concern, I suppose, is seeing those adjustments that have had to be made. That it's approximately 9,000, for example, in the last difference you explained, and it's still the same now. So we need to get onto that as soon as possible. That's scope 3, so that is much more difficult for us to change, but we do need to see and look into the procurement that we do. We've included social value more, which we're including environmentalism in there too, more local procuring. But I do feel that we've got something like the outdoor public spaces. We've got Rory and Rosa on the call, but the public space, green spaces contract that we have, that we are looking in the future to see where that goes, how we change policy if we are going to change. And I feel that's Rory can update. We'll have that coming to perhaps not our committee, but other committees looking at which way is the best way forward with that. And we definitely need to look into what's the best way in which we can handle and get a grip of our emissions on that kind of contract as well. So thank you. I'll go to Councillor Dundas and then Councillor Chinningworth, who've got their hands up. Thank you. And then I'll go around the room as well if there's anyone else. So
thank you, Chair. Thank you very much for the report. I'm glad you picked up on the procurement thing, because that's going to be one of my questions, why there's been quite a big drop between the 2 years. I think my only real question on that is, you say that we take the top 10 largest procurement things. Firstly, I just want to, I take it when we look at that, we're talking about projects, are we? Because obviously some projects involve lots of separate procurements. If we're thinking of sort of like the Northern Sports Park or something, obviously there's probably 100,000 procurement contracts in that. But I take it, we look at a project as a whole, as one unit. So we look at the 10 biggest projects. And do we look at sort of, I think we're including CBH and Fora in there. So are we looking at sort of 10 from each, or in other words 30 overall, because they're separate organizations, or is it just 10 combined we're looking at? And also with M4, how do we sort of, when we're looking at the CO2 impact or something, for example, when so the events company hires the Charter Hall or something and puts on a big event using lots of electricity, Who do we actually allocate that to? Does that come under? I know it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of another, because it's ultimately we're responsible for it. But are we allocating that to our emissions from our commercial services in a separate way? And I suppose my only real comment is obviously looking forward. When we're looking at targets, this year 2021 is going to have some very odd figures in it. I mean, I'm assuming that whilst we haven't been using Rowan House and the Town Hall, we haven't had the aircon and heating and all the lights on full. Well, they haven't been being used very much. I know there's been a lot of computers on, no doubt. So I think probably next year we're going to see possibly some quite good figures in terms of CO2 reduction, but we probably shouldn't get waylaid by them. You know, we've probably got to really ignore them a little bit and start looking at them in 2 or 3 years' time. So I think in terms of whether we look at 3 or 5 year targets, it's quite complicated at the moment, because we've got some very strange figures going to be coming through. So that's just a comment, really.
Thank you, Paul. I'll come back to Ben shortly. I'll go to Councillor Chillingworth first. I'll just say, as you weren't on the panel in the last few meetings, Councillor Dundas, we have discussed scope and what is involved in scope, and we believe that the things we have most control over, we should involve within our plans. It's only when it's beyond our control. So Ben will come back and explain more on that. And I agree about this year and the changes that would have had on our CO2, but we've got quite a good trajectory over the years because we have been monitoring it so closely, and I think we will take that trajectory and take this as an anomaly. But I do agree with Ben's analysis of how technology changes so much. We need to have a shorter time frame in which we turn these plans around and keep stepping up. If we say in 7 years' time we might meet it, a lot of things happen, don't they, like Brexit, right down to the wire. I want to be challenging ourselves as an organisation step by step and making sure we meet those targets year on year rather than having too long a target. But that's my quick response. Peter, I'll come to you and then we go back to Ben. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Ben. Yeah, that we shouldn't forget that we've already reduced our emissions by 40% over the last few years. So what we're trying to do now is getting harder. And it's going to be lumpy, I feel, because new technologies are going to come in. Suddenly we will be successful in one area, but still slow in another. So we can't expect a slow, steady reduction. It's going to be different each year, and it might stand still and then it might shoot forward. I think there are 1 or 2 things I would like to see added. You're mentioning in 5.13, Ben, best practice from other local authorities. That's important, picking up what others are doing. But I should like to see a regular benchmarking comparison between what we are doing and what others are doing. I would hate to think we're standing still, which I'm sure we're not, but I think once we do that, we'll see we're actually quite far ahead. But I should like this to be an ongoing benchmarking, perhaps against the top 10 or something like that, or against the average. But I think that's important for us to see how we're doing against others. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. No other questions at this point, so I'll go back to you, Ben. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to answer Councillor Dundas's questions. So yeah, for the contracts, it is for the project. So the sports park was one of the major contributors to the emissions from procured goods and services in 1920. And so how it works for CBH and Amphora, so some of the CBH contracts do come up, it's basically top 10 overall sort of contracts that the council has, and that includes ones from CBH that happen to be in there. So I think there was boiler servicing was in there for last year. So it's not 10 from each of those organisations, it's as a whole. That's 10, that's what we do. And then in regards to the allocation of electricity in gas consumption, the way we do it at the moment, if events, company are holding, I don't know, weddings and events in Town Hall and Leisure World, at the moment, that will come under the council's consumption, because we're just looking at meter readings from those buildings. So we're not actually apportioning that to anyone. I'm not sure this is something you asked, but for CBH, their housing stock is measured separately. That comes under our scope 3, apart from the sheltered housing stock, which is in our, technically is in the scope 3, but we're including it in our net zero emissions target, because we were sort of ambitious and realised that I think we could influence that. So that's the only difference there. So, and yes, we have to obviously acknowledge your point about the odd figures in 2021. I think we'd obviously see that and acknowledge that we'd be expecting that to happen. And yeah, we know they look a bit weird, so as an anomaly kind of thing. And then responding to Councillor Chillingworth, yeah, in terms of benchmarking, I think that's a good idea. Do you want kind of that in terms of emission reductions compared to other local authorities? I think that's probably like one of the easiest sort of comparisons to make, I guess, but just to check on that, really. Yeah, that's it.
Yes, we don't want to make it complicated. As long as it's a meaningful figure, I would leave it to you to sort of work out what is the best to do.
Thank you, Peter. I think there will have to be some complication, because if we compare, say, to Norwich, and they only have scope 1 and 2 direct changes, whereas we include scope 3, I think we might be harsh upon ourselves, or we might over exaggerate our own performance. So I think it's a really good thing to do, but I do think we'd have to make sure we're comparing like with like on that. But it's good, and it'll be a good challenge, and I hope we come towards the top. The representative from the Carbon Management Trust, we worked with them over the years. As I say, I was first on cabinet, and they often couldn't publicly say exactly where we were, but they would say we were about in the top 3 for our reduction of that 40%. So we often were doing very well. We need to keep that up. Others are catching us up. So I've got one more councillor to speak, and then Rory Doyle as well. So Councillor Lorcan Whitehead, please. Lorcan.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, thank you for the report. Really good, clear, comprehensive report. I was just wondering, I mean, one of the big changes in the figures is around the waste, and that's because we're gathering more data from more sources. And sorry. It's pudding time at home after a young person's dinner. Yeah, so I'm wondering if are we missing any other data from locations, and can we push for more, or do we have a kind of a more comprehensive picture now that these other locations have come on stream?
Thank you, Lorcan. It's a shame, yes, that we're having to add things on, but I think your essence and mine would be we want to include as much as possible that we're responsible for, so we can then tackle it. So I'll go to Rory, then Ben, I'll let you finish up on this report, and I think we can note it, hopefully positively, and move on. Rory, please.
Thank you, Chairman. It was just coming back to Councillor Dundas's point, really, on some of the anomalies we might see in data this year. And just to give the panel reassurance that actually it's one of our principles that we've set out, that we will see new baselines in terms of data, both from an emissions perspective, but we'll see it in other areas of our work. Air quality would be a good example as well. And actually we use it as a driver to ensure that we don't get back to where we were before. And whilst we might not be able to maintain the levels because of the very peculiar issues around COVID, what we absolutely want to do is use it as a launch pad so as not to get back to where we were before. So I think just to give panel that reassurance, and we see it as we're seeing it in people, aren't we, in terms of behaviour change. I think there's actually a kind of a once in a generation opportunity here to really make a difference based on some of that, because people have noticed a difference. So I just thought that was a key point to make.
Thank you, Rory. Ben, I'll come back to you just to finish off, to answer any points and to conclude.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So in terms of Councillor Whitehead's point about the waste, yeah. So I'm just got the figures up now actually on my screen of what buildings we have. So we have all the key ones. We have Leisure World, Charter Hall, Crematorium, Rowan House, High Woods, the Castle, and Heckworth Close, and yes, the two car parks we've got, St Mary's and Runwell Street. I think we've got most of the key ones there in terms of offices and buildings we operate out of. There may well be other ones that we get. I'm not too sure why we didn't have these last time. When I asked the figures from the waste team, that's what we got, so I just added them on. But I think most of the key ones, buildings are covered there. And also just to mention, if anyone does have any questions for the Carbon Trust, David is on the line, just to remind you if you do have anything to say to him as well.
David, I suppose I'd welcome you in at this point. Is there anything you want to add about Colchester and its performance so far and the challenges we may face?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the invitation, first of all, and yeah, interesting discussion. I mean, the point that Councillor Chillingworth made about where Colchester kind of stands against you know, other councils, it's a tricky question because there's very different approaches been adopted by councils right throughout the country actually, and some councils are looking just at scope 1 and 2. Other councils are looking at scope 1, 2, 3. Some councils have set targets that line up with the government's 2050 net zero. Others are looking at 2040, 2030. There's nuances between carbon neutrality and net zero. And it is actually quite difficult to get an accurate picture. You'll probably see lots of statements that say we've saved X, but X of what? So it can be a little bit tricky to try and understand that as the first point I'd say. The second point I'd mention just in relation to Colchester, I mean, over the past, I don't know, 18 months, we've probably worked with 40 councils, big and small, from small town councils right up to larger combined authorities and even devolved administrations looking at footprints and stuff. And from what I understand, having worked with you guys for many years actually, is that you are certainly in the leading end of what's happening in terms of local government carbon management. You know, the fact that you're looking at your scope 3 emissions and looking at things like procured goods and services, which is a very, very difficult area to do anything about and influence. The scope of what you're trying to measure and manage is extensive, and yeah, I would say Colchester's approach is very pragmatic. You've initially focused on everything you can do across your own estate, what you can influence, what you've got control over, what you can measure and manage. Beyond that, you begin, and it was mentioned by a couple of speakers already. It's not that the easy stuff is done. There's probably going to be other things that you can do in the short term, and I kind of endorse the approach that Rory and his team have taken in terms of what can we do in the next 3 years and what's our trajectory beyond that. But things will get harder and things will probably get a bit more expensive, and national government is going to need to step in to support local government with this agenda. It can't necessarily be done all by ourselves, but I guess the kind of a sensible approach is to try and map all that out and really understand where your levers of influence are, really keep on top of what national government is going to do, be able to talk to national government, tell them what you need. There's going to need to be a very open dialogue about that. 2050 net zero for the UK is very challenging in itself. 2030 for Colchester would be really, really challenging if you're looking at your entire borough. It's still going to be challenging to do net zero 2030 for your own estate, but it's not impossible. And the approach that I've seen and I've seen worked with is very sensible, and I would say well done so far.
Thank you, David. I promise I didn't know he was going to say that, so that's all positive news. Thank you for being here for those years and seeing us progress and helping us through this more difficult time, as you acknowledge as well. Lorcan, you've put your hand up again, so I'll come back to you quickly.
Yeah, just briefly, thank you, David. That's really positive to hear. I was just wondering why we've got you here. I guess one of the questions that come at in the report and the discussion is, what the kind of milestones going forward should be. So I just wondered if you could give us anything, your view on what the sort of key milestones or review points should be.
Yeah, I mean, there is no right way to do this. I can tell you what we've kind of seen with other councils, and we've seen councils set carbon budgets, for example. So looking at 5-year increments, for example. That's one way of doing it. There are your ultimate metric really is your tons of CO2 and your percentage reduction. There's other councils that are looking to align with the Paris Agreement, so looking at a 1.5 degrees trajectory and looking at a science-based target and trying to align with the share that you would need to deliver in terms of carbon reduction to align with a Paris Agreement. So that's another approach to take. But I think regardless of kind of which trajectories or which targets you take, I mean, I think the sensible thing is to set yourself clear actions and be able to see, are they implemented in full, learn from those actions and be able to plan again. And 2030 isn't that far away, but there is a lot of uncertainty, and it was mentioned at the start, I think, by Ben, in terms of technology readiness, technology affordability. When's that going to come on stream? What are you replacing? What assets are still functional within your estate that you may want to retain in use, but then replace them at the appropriate time to get that sort of step change? And Councillor Chillingworth mentioned it at the start, that this isn't necessarily a straight line trajectory. There will be a point when you do a significant change out on your transport vehicles for EV, and when that combines with the grid decarbonisation, you will see big chunks of your footprint reduced. So I suppose I would say plan ahead, plan for what's achievable, measure and monitor, and learn from how you've worked it up, and go again.
Thank you for the question, Lorcan, and thank you again, David, for your answer and support. One thing I would just say, I think we should conclude here, and again, thank you, Ben, for this, and thank you, David, for your support. One thing that we have accepted, our housing stock is a big part that we can't include in all our scope if we have realistic targets to net 30, to net zero 2030. But I do want to acknowledge that, one, we have made investment already through Cabinet very recently, which we may touch on later, to reduce our footprint there. I just want to make sure we are measuring that as well as best as we can, because we know it's individual housing and individual tenants, but to sort of have a baseline understanding. And I've talked about it before, how we can still try and take that as a scope 3 plus, and know that we won't meet net zero with that, but what can we achieve and what targets can we keep achieving by decarbonising our housing stock, which is so important. So I just wanted to flag that as something that I know Lorcan had raised it when we were looking at scope before. I agreed, but to be realistic, how do we keep it alongside? So I just want to say that if we can keep that alongside as a measurable target, let's please do that. Mark Goetze, you've come in as well now, so over to you, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to say on housing, I mean, obviously housing is absolutely one of the major areas of emissions, and a lot of that is to do with boilers, and the government announced that, I think it's 2030, but there's going to be a cut-off point where you'll no longer be able to buy gas boilers. And it was announced a few weeks ago. So I'm just wondering if you've heard anything from national government on that, and have they got any plans for how they're going to facilitate the replacement of gas boilers in the kind of housing that we manage?
I'll just touch on what I've heard. There was an announcement a few weeks, more than a few weeks ago, actually, probably a few months ago, about government funding for some of our stock. But it was, unfortunately, it was more headline than some of the grit, the detail. meant we didn't have as much chance of getting it. But I do think we are working on bids there, and Ben or even David, if you could pick up on that. And of course, you will know that the government scheme for greening housing is actually for properties that are owned by the homeowner, not for our housing stock, the more recent programme that they're doing. So Ben, is there anything you know beyond what I've just said about how we can access any of the funding for government? Otherwise, most of the funding we're plugging ahead with is our own.
Yeah, so I guess it's not related to the housing, but in terms of improving the emissions from our sort of corporate estate, we've got the public sector decarbonisation scheme, which we made a bid for, which I'll go into later in the report, so not to touch on that. I guess just people who are interested, the gas boiler thing, I think it said for all new homes from 2025 they wouldn't install gas boilers into new homes. I believe that's correct. And then from mid sort of 2030s they were looking to phase out gas boilers from there. Yeah, that's all I've got on that, but David might be able to add as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a couple of points really. I mean, the government and the Committee on Climate Change and anybody who's involved in this sector, acknowledge how difficult it's going to be to decarbonize UK housing stock, and in particular on the side of heat decarbonisation. The solutions for that will lie across a variety of technologies. Heat pumps, which are kind of electrically powered, will be a big part of it. Heat networks will be a big part of it. Hydrogen potentially in certain regions where there are lined up to sort of geared for that type of technology. There isn't necessarily one answer. There's been quite a few releases from various government departments over the last 3-4 weeks that sort of set out at a very high level ambitions and plans around that. So we had the 10-point plan that Boris, the 10-point plan about a month ago. That was followed up by the spending review, and then there was an energy white paper released earlier this week alongside the Committee on Climate Change 6 carbon budget. And within all of those documents, there are various kind of directions of travel, I would say, for how to deal with housing stock. And there's a pilot running at the moment, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. There was 50 million allocated to address energy efficiency and in particular heating and insulation across social housing. It is very likely that will be rolled out into a much larger national programme over the coming years. And as I said, the white paper and some of those other policy papers have indicated directions of travel on that. There isn't full detail on that now, but just an acknowledgement that national government needs to step in to support the delivery of this.
Thank you, David. Yes, and we're not going to wait. As you all know, we put a paper through Cabinet where we are spending over 4 million on our first tranche of improving our housing stock. But we will take, of course, any government subsidy and money that will come our way to help that with our ground source heat pump up at Northern Gateway. That is government funded from Bays, and we're the one pilot out of 12 that is actually using the ground source heat pump rather than a gas boiler. So, and we are using air source heat pumps in some of our renovated homes that Colchester own as well. Anyway, we'll leave it there because we're straying off from the paper. But thank you, Ben, for that paper. And can we just all agree that we've noted that? I don't think we need a vote on this because it's acknowledging the plan that we want to follow going ahead. So I don't see any dissent. I've seen nods. So thank you for that. We'll agree, and that's noted, and we'll work towards those challenging targets. Thank you. Just going to the next item. So the next item, I believe, is presented by Rosa on the Fleet Transition Forward Plan. So Rosa, please.
Hello, good evening, everyone. We're going to do a very short presentation for you. So hopefully a colleague will bring that up on the screen and I shall start. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so the paper that we're presenting this evening sets out the plan for the transition of the council fleet to a zero carbon fleet by 2030. The report's fairly detailed, but hopefully it sets out clearly the aspirations and the actions that the council's wanting to take. And I want to thank at this point the Energy Savings Trust and Steve Williams in particular, who's going to speak with me in this joint presentation this evening, and his colleagues who've worked closely with us over several months in reviewing our existing fleet, challenging us on our future plans and helping us to develop this plan, a plan that we feel confident that can be delivered, and their expertise has been really valuable. So I'll just hand over to Steve now just to give you an overview of the Energy Savings Trust and their role. So next slide, please. Over to you, Steve.
I don't know if you can hear me. I can't switch my video on, so I'll just speak. Oh, there I am. Right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. Energy Saving Trust was set up in '92 as a consequence of the Rio Earth Summit. We've been in transport since 2002, and transport is now the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in what we call UK PLC, around about 28%. Our objective is to help people and organisations cut harmful emissions by promoting sustainable and efficient use of energy. I work within the fleet support management team, and we do this by reviewing fleets and helping them to reduce cost and emissions, manage their grey fleet and transition to ultra low emission vehicles. We have other areas of the team, such as our local government support team, who assist with local authorities with clean air and transport initiatives, share best practice between fleets and local authorities, and specialist teams who manage grants for either cargo bikes or on-street charge points, accredit retrofit suppliers, provide fuel efficiency training, and upskill supply chain through EV training. And that is the Energy Saving Trust.
Thanks, Steve. Next slide, please. So the council's got an ambition to transition all of its current fleet to EV by no later than 2030. And in order to achieve this aim, the strategy sets out a number of principles which are shown on this slide. Underpinning these aims and to drive forward the plan, the report also sets out a number of principles and steps that the council will take to ensure that the decision that it takes at each stage of the plans are carefully considered, well informed and are robust. Next slide, please. So this plan shows that the council will transition its fleet over the next 10 years to electric or greener fleet. And as set out in the report, we've already commenced the first phase, and we're going to see medium and small vans and cars being introduced next year, plus 4 hybrid vehicles as well. There are 5 vehicles that we could consider alternatives to diesel, which are shown from 2022. But as set out in the report and according to the principles, in looking at those vehicles, we will review the data, we will monitor and track our usage of that fleet. We'll undertake a robust evaluation of the operational needs and financial viability of it. We'll look at and challenge the number of vehicles and the size of the vehicles. We'll look at both lease hire and purchasing options, considering the existing budget, and we'll base our decisions on the expert recommendations and guidance. Technology in the market is anticipated to improve as we head towards 2024, and the officers are more certain that the transition will be more effective at that point. However, the key to a really effective transition to electric fleet is the investment and installation of infrastructure, and the report sets out that there's a number of options, and officers are already and will continue to investigate what those options might be. So I'm just going to hand over to Steve now, who's going to give you a summary on the approach that the council's taking on a wider context. So next slide, please. And over to you, Steve.
Thank you. From my point of view, the timeline that was shown in the previous slide is a flexible, positive and pragmatic approach to the electrification of the Colchester fleet. I deal with a lot of organisations who would like to electrify everything now, But organisations such as Colchester need to understand that all elements have to be present at the same time to electrify a fleet. This includes the understanding of the vehicles and that there is a suitable electric vehicle available now. In the current electric vehicle environment, whilst I would argue that there are small and medium vans, cars and refuse collection vehicles that are available now, which will save you carbon and usually make financial sense, for all other sectors at the moment, maybe not so much. But that is rapidly changing. For the larger vans, 3.5 tonne or even 4.2 tonne with the deregulation, they are difficult at the moment to currently justify on a whole life cost basis, but they do exist. I recently did a whole life costing for another organisation, and a 3.5 tonne van came out on their usage patterns as costing them more than £10,000 a year more to operate than the diesel vehicle. By 2025, some industry commentators believe that there will be price parity in the screen price of almost all cars and vans. So at that point, 3.5 tonne van will save you money and carbon. In the other LCV sectors, such as pickups, and through most of the HCV sectors, heavy commercial vehicle sector, with the exception of the RCVs already mentioned, so running from 4.5 tonne through to 37 tonnes, EVs are not really physically available yet. 7.5 tonne Fuso Canter is due for a relaunch in 2020, 2023, and Renault, DAF and Scania have all recently announced ranges of articulated and rigid HCVs with a gross vehicle weight of up to 37 tonnes, which means over the next 2 to 3 years there will be many more options available from the manufacturers, and that by 2025 a full range of electric heavy commercial vehicles and specialist vehicles should be on the market. As for the pickups, there will be several American style and size pickups such as the Tesla and the Rivian, which are due for launch in 2022 and 2023. We estimate, however, the smaller European and Japanese style pickups that we're all familiar with in the UK will come through a little bit later, maybe 2024 to 2026. Financially, most council use CapEx when procuring vehicles, and that can be a problem because the approach lends itself to looking at just the initial purchase price when making a procurement decision. In this environment, EVs will never be purchased before the screen price parity is achieved. But over its lifetime, EVs can demonstrate massive financial savings. So we recommend the use of whole life costings when making a procurement decision and factoring in all costs into the mix, such as running costs, taxation and maintenance. Once you've made that decision, you can use those calculations to put a price on the greenhouse gas emissions that you've saved. And if money is a finite resource, which in every council I've come across it is, you can make decisions about where to spend your money. For example, the purchase of one refuse collection vehicle at £400,000 may actually be better spent than spending that money on 7 heavy commercial vehicles or 15 cars in terms of overall savings. But unless you understand what your costs per mile and cost per tonne of CO2 are, you won't know where to put your money in the most effective way. The decision to electrify a vehicle is reliant on many factors: the availability of a suitable EV, whole life cost, suitability of the vehicles in terms of payload, space, and the range that they're able to undertake under one charge. But that's just one side of the equation, the vehicle side. The other side of the equation is the energy side. It takes power to run a vehicle, whether that energy comes from liquid fuels such as diesel or from electricity stored in the battery. Whilst it only takes approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the energy to power an electric vehicle as it does to power an equivalent diesel vehicle, because of the efficiencies of the engines involved and the electric motors involved, unless you understand what energy you need to power the vehicle to do the job, you won't understand whether you can actually power the fleet that you are electrifying, and to do that in the most cost efficient way. Any vehicle, whatever the powertrain, risks becoming just an expensive ornament unless you understand how to put that power into the vehicle at the right time and in the right place. CVC are taking the time to investigate that with great care, and that, I believe, means that with the flexible planning in the timeline and making sure they understand the power constraints that they may have and the power requirements that they may have, they will have a successful road towards electrification.
Thank you, Steve. Next slide, please. So the plan, as Steve's just alluded to there and set out in the paper, is that it will be an adaptable plan, something that we can make sure as a council we adapt to the changing environment and the market. And what this document sets out is a clear aim, though, that we will transition our vehicles to electric fleet. And it sets out some clear principles that we will work towards to ensure that the decisions, as I said, and the investment that we do is done so wisely and for the best impact. And it should also be noted that whilst we've talked mainly about the fleet itself and its infrastructure and purchasing, etc., there are other aspects that the officers will be continuing to work and develop on to ensure that we have got a greener and cleaner fleet management, and those are listed on this slide and within the report. So that just brings us to the end of that. A very quick summary. As I explained, this is quite a detailed report. So Steve and I and my team members as well, Tracy and Rob, are available to ask any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa, and thank you, Steve. It is a very good paper and very good ambitions that I know I've been pushing for. So thank you, Rosa, for getting around to this much more strategic approach than, as Steve may have suggested, people like me saying we want it as soon as possible. So I appreciate that, and it's much more thought through. And I know there's been an emphasis on EV vehicles. I'm sure in the reviews that are talked about, we'll look at what other technology there is at the same time that could be even more carbon neutral. And one thing I would say, and it did come up in the last summary, is the e-cargo bikes and other solutions like that we will be looking to at every stage that reduce the dependency on journeys and traffic and cars of any kind, whatever they produce. Okay, thank you for that. We've got 4 councillors lining up for questions. So I've got Councillor Scordis, Councillor Dundas, Councillor Gocher and Councillor Chillingworth. So Councillor Lee Scordis first, please. Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a very good report, and it's very positive. I think visually it offers a good way forward of promoting the message that Colchester is doing its part. So social media wise, it would be very effective messaging. Where I do have worries is around the length of time it's going to take to replace some of the vehicles. I understand technology is an issue, but such as the steel cage trucks, they do quite a few miles a day. They're usually driving around certain wards quite a lot of times. Sometimes they're going back to the tip and back. If there's a lot of fly tipping, that's obviously going to lead to a lot more, well, higher emissions. So I'm slightly worried by that, of whether that could be looked at. I'm not sure about the 4x4s, so I've never actually seen them. So I'm not sure if they're more in the rural areas that we send them to, but there are fewer of them. So probably not as big an issue. And the other thing that came to my head when I was reading the report is that we do occasionally have it where our some of our garbage disposal trucks do break down. It is natural. Some of our cars break down, so we expect the truck to occasionally break down. Would it be prudent to maybe purchase an electrical one as a backup to test it, whether that's financially viable? But just a suggestion. And again, it's good messaging for Colchester to say we've purchased our first electric waste service that's being used to cover the shift of this one that's broken down. But just some ideas there I'm mooting.
Thank you, Lee. Helpful, and it's something I think I'd said to the service about having one example at least, which I know we've been using, I think, with one of the cage vehicles. But I'll take a few more questions and come back to you, Rosa. Councillor Dundas, please. Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, a really good report, actually. Lots of it's really been thought about well. I thought Steve's lesson on the practicalities of energy in electric vehicles was very interesting. And I think that goes on with my own comments, really, that I think I made the comment at Cabinet that we do have to be careful about not buying a lot of Betamax video recorders. It's very easy to do. I think certainly with the cars, as I said, I'm anti-leasing. It's always cheaper to buy, but with these, if I was going to buy an electric car, I'll be honest, I wouldn't buy an electric car at the moment. I'd lease it and run it under the warranty and swap it for another one when it's 4 years old. And when we're talking about 7 to 10 years life, and we're talking about whole life costs, obviously if the battery's all failed at 5 years old out of warranty, your whole life costs are going to go massively skewed. Your figures will go out the window, and we'll be looking at a much larger cost. So certainly, I'm very much in favour of electrifying the fleet as soon as possible. But with the cars, I would seriously looking at keeping them for 3 or 4 years, leasing them, running them under warranty, and maybe changing them after 4 years again. And we do have to be practical, because we can't buy things which aren't on the market and don't exist. If there's not an easy fleet of electric refuse vehicles which will do a day's work, then we can't do anything about that, because we can't buy what isn't there. And for all the if our residents don't get their rubbish collected, they will not thank us at all. Us saying, well, we bought electric vehicles, but it packs up after 3 hours, will not wash. And then on the energy thing, I mean, this is the fundamental problem with HGV electric vehicles, that for them to do a day's work, you end up with a battery so large and heavy, you're using a massive amount of energy just to move a very heavy battery about all day, which actually isn't particularly environmentally friendly. And I think that's the other thing we need to be careful about. We refer these, we can't call them zero carbon vehicles, because the electric vehicle is not a zero carbon vehicle for much of the time. It can be, depending on what day you charge it up and where you charge it up from. At the moment, 39% of the UK electricity is from renewable sources. Sometimes it's 80%, sometimes it's 20%. But you are solving a big issue on localized pollution, which we do have in some areas in Colchester. We all know where they are. But if you're using electricity, it's generated somewhere, and you'll still have carbon emissions. And just in the same way that we apportion carbon emissions to the electricity we use in our buildings, we have to apportion some carbon emissions to electricity we use for powering a fleet. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. I'll go to Mark and Peter and then come back. So Mark, please.
Yeah, thanks very much for the report. It's fascinating reading. It seems to me from what's been said that things are going to change quite a lot in the next few years in terms of the technology, and I think that's undoubtedly true, because demand is going to create the supply, because there are demands for these vehicles. I mean, it seems to me as well that the key to making this work is putting the charging points in and the infrastructure, so that you've got that ready for when the vehicles arrive. And what I'm wondering is, with the change in technology and with the kind of new kind of vehicles coming on the market, are we able to put the infrastructure in now, or start doing so, or do we have to wait to find out what kind of vehicles we purchase before we can put the charging points in? I mean, I'm not up to scratch with the technology enough to answer that, so I'm just wondering what the answer is. Because obviously, if we can start putting the infrastructure in now, without actually having purchased the vehicles beforehand, that is something that we can do. So I'm just wondering, what the feasibility is with that. I know, for example, as well, that Nottingham, for example, has electrified their buses. And obviously a bus, to me, will have to go on quite a large route. What kind of infrastructure do they use to charge up their buses? And is that similar to the kind of infrastructure we would use to charge up our bin collection lorries or whatever? The other thing, in terms of electric, we've heard earlier on in the meeting that the grid is improving. And as the grid continues to improve in terms of moving on to more renewables, then obviously that will improve our emission data. So I think we do need to bear in mind that the electric grid is improving in terms of where it's sourcing its electric from. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And Councillor Chinningworth. Peter, please.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this report. I thought it was fascinating. And I do like the pragmatic approach it's taking. The problems that are going to come up throughout the life of this, we just can't see at this moment in time, I don't think. We don't know the technology, and all sorts of unforeseen circumstances or problems may arise. So it's got to be a very adaptive plan. And I'm sure those who wrote it must accept that and realize it. I was also going to mention infrastructure, and I was particularly struck by the minimum cost of 500,000 to put the infrastructure in to Shrub End. This to me was a huge amount of money. I was wondering why it is so high. Is it mainly the substation that's being discussed? That was my main question, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I think from what I've heard so far, it is a substantial piece of kit that would need to go in there. So we'll go back to officers, and if there's any other questions, please do then line up and we'll come back for more. But I'll go back to officers now. Hopefully you've noted down all of those points.
I have. And I will ask Steve to join me on this, and I'll hand over some of the points to him to help bring his expertise on some of those questions. In terms of Councillor Scourges's question, in terms of length of time for replacing vehicles, we will consider purchase versus lease at each step of the process. The position that we're in as a council at the moment, ignoring the electric vehicles that we've already agreed that will be introduced next year, is new fleet that have come on board. We've pursued a purchase option. What that enables us to do is, when we are at the point where through our protocols and our processes through this plan, we feel that there is a robust position that we can replace some of those vehicles with an electric version, we are able to sell those vehicles because they're in our possession, which will contribute to the cost of purchasing the next version. But I do want us to consider that that does need to be in a considered approach, using those principles as I've set out, to make sure that the decision that we make is right, both operationally and financially as well. I don't know if you wanted to add anything more to that, Steve, in terms of bringing that programme forward.
Yeah, I think so. I think the first speaker mentioned particularly the caged vehicles. The cage vehicles were replaced very recently, and the reason being that when we did the analysis on the cage vehicles, they are a 3.5 ton vehicle, and the financial cost at the point to run one of those vehicles as an EV is prohibitive. So just in round numbers, you can buy a diesel vehicle for just about the thick end of 30,000. But at the time, there was only one vehicle on the market that could have done that job, and that was around about 75,000 before you added any of the bits on in terms of the cage, and the extra is just the chassis cab itself. So it wasn't, in my view, and I put that in the report that I wrote, a good use of the council's money. So again, and that's the pragmatic side of things. What you had was a very old and very dirty fleet. I think there were Euro 4 or Euro 3 engines in it, which are particularly bad when it comes to air quality. So the recommendation was change it as quickly as possible into the newest diesel vehicles that you can, and then run those and replace them when the EVs come online and they become financially viable for you. So whilst I acknowledge that, you know, they're very high profile and it would be lovely to have one now. If you were to buy those vehicles, one of those vehicles, you probably wouldn't be able to buy any of the small vans and cars, which will save you money over the lifetime that they're running, because you've spent all the capex on vehicles that will cost you money. So you know, it was, again, it's this pragmatic approach that you need to use every time you're looking to replace a vehicle. I would suggest that where you can, you extend vehicles for as long as possible if you think there's a vehicle going to be coming in the very near future, yeah, rather than buy something and then run that risk of losing a huge amount of depreciation. Because one of the problems that you have when you buy a vehicle and then sell it short is, because the depreciation of the vehicle happens in the first couple of years, if you've run it for a couple of years and then you come to sell it, you've lost well over 60–70% of the value of the vehicle. So you know, you want to be running that for as long as possible to minimize that risk and balance out that is your value loss. So it is a very difficult balancing act.
Thanks, Steve. If I'll move on to the next point, there was questions around the actual refuse vehicles, and the question around whether buses and the technology that Nottingham are using with buses is a similar technology. I don't know if you want to just discuss a bit more about the much heavier fleet, Steve, and the infrastructure that's needed to support that.
Again, with the actual charging posts required go up dramatically, depending on what kind of power you're putting in, the speed that you want to put the charging post in. Now, I'm not familiar with Nottingham's bus. I do know they have a bus fleet, and I have seen pictures of their bus charging areas, and it's very impressive. It's a very big car park with lots of overhead wires and very big charging posts, which I think are you know, quite rapid chargers. So to give you an idea, a 7.4 kilowatt charger that you would use to charge a car probably costs about £500 just for the box. We're not talking about the wiring that goes into it, just for the actual box. When you get to the 11 kilowatt charger or a 22 kilowatt charger, you've probably gone up to about 5,000 to 10,000. And then when you get up to a 50 kilowatt charger, you're talking £50,000 or £1,000. That actually is small beans in terms of the costs of putting the rest of the stuff in. Where most of the cost goes in putting infrastructure, if you haven't got to put a substation in, which I understand you do, and the substations cost £500,000 plus, is actually the cabling, because it's the groundworks that cost the money, because you have got to dig something up, you've got to put a hole in, and that is where the vast majority of cost comes. With most organisations that we deal with, our first recommendation is if you've got to dig up a car park and you think you're going to put electric in there in the future, put the cabling in now, put the trunking in now, because you've only got that one cost, you've got that cost already, it will save you an absolute fortune. So in terms of overall, so what kind of infrastructure that you need, I don't know what Nottingham does in terms of charging their buses, and wherefore if they need to put, if they've got 50 kilowatt DC chargers because they need to charge them rapidly and get them back out, an RCV fleet doesn't need that. What you normally, an RCV fleet has 8 to 12 hours where it's static, so you can use a much smaller charging infrastructure in terms of the power of the charger. So an 11 kilowatt or a 22 kilowatt charger, which is significantly cheaper than that 50 kilowatt DC charger we talked about, in order to charge the vehicle, because it's sat there for 8 to 12 hours. You'll know, I talked about understanding what you're going to need to power that vehicle to do that fleet. That'll depend on the distance the vehicle's traveling, how many compressions it does with the compactor at the back, how many bin lifts it does, how it's driven. We get a really good idea about that by looking at your diesel fleet now, because that, you know, it's that includes the way that it includes the number of bin lifts, the number of lifts that are done, the topography of the area, the way the vehicles are driven. That's already reflected in your miles per gallon you achieve on your fleet, and that we're able to take that and convert that into energy, and then convert that into what an RCV might need. So, you know, the calculations to do that are there, as long as you understand precisely what your diesel vehicle is doing at the moment, and from that you can look at what you're going to need in terms of infrastructure and power that you're going to require to power your fleet.
Thanks, Steve. And just to pick up on your point that you mentioned there, Steve, the council is providing some investment funding to do some refurbishment work at Shrub End Depot. We've got a programme underway, and one of those elements is resurfacing the car park. And as part of that programme, we are putting in that underground tunnelling to make sure that we are prepared for that next stage when when we get to that. So we are trying to prepare for the.
It's amazing how much money a bit of rope and a bit of trunking can save you. Yeah. So
the other points that were raised, and again, I'm going to have to hand over to you, Steve, because you are the expert with this, is that the comments around electric not necessarily being zero carbon, but that the grid is improving, and I know you can talk.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. If you were to electrify a vehicle today, you could expect to reduce your carbon emissions. Not your tailpipe emissions are zero, but the carbon emissions related to the production and the transportation of the electricity. When we do carbon footprinting, we apply that to an electric vehicle. So if you were to electrify a vehicle today, depending on the size of the vehicle, you're going to get 60 to 70% reduction of your carbon emissions immediately. Based on the projections of where the grid is going to be by 2030, we expect you to have the same vehicle. If you buy a vehicle today and you're running that vehicle in 2030, you will save 60%, 70% by buying it today, and by 2030 that saving will be 90%. So yes, there is still an amount of carbon attributable to that vehicle if you are running it off the grid. The only way to get to net zero is to have a private wire source, PV or wind of your own that you are, or an anaerobic digester, which will come with some CO2 because of the production, the way it does. But that again will minimise, will generally be lower than the grid source. So there are ways of minimising that beyond, but just using the grid, 60, 70% now, 90% by 2030.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's most of the points and questions covered now. If I can hand back to you, Chair, in case there's any further questions.
Thank you, Rosa. Well, I have two other questions to follow up from Councillor Scordis and Councillor Dundas, so I'll go to you firstly.
Chair, it's a very quick one. I think Rosa may have already answered it, but I think just over a year ago we had a paper come to before us saying that we were going to leave the Shrub End site. So I'm guessing from the refurbishment that's happening there, that's not happening. Otherwise, this is a big investment for a site we're likely to leave.
So those discussions aren't underway at the moment, as I understand it. And there is funding, as I said, being made to improve the site so that we are in a better way to keep that site operating as it is.
I could give a political answer. We've been a bit let down by county on that one over the years, after trying to put in as much discussion as possible to move that forward. We have not been able to move that forward yet. We still hope for a future vision in the long run to move out of that site, because it is hard to configure it, but the team are doing a really good job with it, with a sort of medium term situation of us staying there for now. But longer term, we have a better vision, hopefully. Thank you, Rosa. I'll move to Councillor Dundas. Paul, please.
Thanks, and thank you for the answers. Very interesting, actually. I think the only brief comment I would make is when I was talking really about purchases and whole life costs. I think really what I was getting at is that the residual values at the moment of electric vehicles are very unpredictable. Some of them seem to be retaining. I'm talking about cars here really because they're the main market. Some of them are holding their price very well. Some of them seem almost impossible to sell and virtually worthless on the used market. I think some of it is around the way the batteries are sold. And that's really, I meant to ask the question earlier, in the report, obviously when we're looking at the practicalities of the vehicles, that we want them to do a certain, they need to do a certain mileage between charges to actually, particularly I'm thinking of our small vans and cars, they're on the road quite a lot and on call. What factor are we putting in for battery degradation? Because you can buy a car new and it starts off with a 250-mile range. You can never be quite sure once you've recharged it thousands of times and it's 5 years old. On some of them, the range does drop quite considerably, and then we may well find they get to 4 years old and they won't actually do the job for us because we're having to recharge them too often. So what risk factor are we putting in for that? And I think my other comment also about the charges is obviously it wouldn't work at Shrub End. I think it wouldn't be practical, but obviously if we're putting in infrastructure and high capacity ducting, we should never miss the chance of possibly a revenue opportunity, because demand for charging points all over the place is going to go up, even amongst our own staff, probably. So we should also factor in the fact that if we put in new charging points, there may be revenue opportunities there for providing workplace charging to staff, and also occasionally in some areas, certainly hopefully they'll be going to our car parks eventually to members of the public. So, you may well find that, yeah, you've got a capital cost, but you've got a long-term revenue stream as well.
Thank you, Paul. Rosa, is there anything you want to pick up there? I mean, I know
yeah.
Sorry.
I'll ask you to come in again in terms of the batteries questions.
Okay, in terms of the batteries, what we do is we look at the ranges of the vehicle and the batteries, and look at the ranges of the vehicles that are being operated. If you consider the latest version of the cars, because you're particularly interested in the cars, you look at an e-Corsa, an E208, a 64 kilowatt battery Leaf. They've all got ranges of over 200 miles. Of the data that was presented to me on your fleet, none of your vehicles go anywhere near that on a daily basis. So in terms of the battery degradation, even if it was 10%, so you have 90% left at the end of this life, which is at the extreme end of the predictions, you will still have more than enough range in those vehicles to fulfill the job that they're required to do. But this goes back to the original statement about understanding your vehicles, understanding your range, understanding what you want them to do, making sure that when you buy a vehicle, you've bought a vehicle that's fit for purpose, which is why we're not saying rush in and buy everything electric now. You have to understand what you're going to do with them, how you're going to use them, and whether the vehicle that you are looking to buy is fit for purpose. So, but I don't think in terms of, certainly in cars, with the ranges that are out there now, that you have anything to worry about based on the data that I've seen and the ranges that the vehicles are driving at the moment. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. And then in terms of the infrastructure and potential income from charging, I think you're right in terms of the Shrub End development. It might be more tricky, but it will be something that we'll be looking at in terms of not just maybe getting an income from people using them as a charging point, but other options around that. As I said in the report, we're looking at lots of different ways of how we can make the infrastructure work for us, and considering all the different options that are available to us. I guess with charging points elsewhere, also we're looking at introducing charging points at Rowan House. That might be something that we can then expand into, but parking is not my portfolio. So I don't know if Rory does want to comment or add to that, because I don't want to be saying things that I shouldn't.
So yeah, happy to come in there. So just to clarify, the procurement that we're doing at the moment around the EV infrastructure has two elements to it, which also includes the procurement of infrastructure for our car parks. So there is that, we're exploring all those opportunities too, Councillor Dundas. So just to give you that reassurance.
Thank you, Rosa, Rory and Steve, for all those answers. Are there any further questions on the paper? I think it's a very good one. I think we've all covered the aspects where it's positive, where it's pragmatic, where we may find issues and need to, I'm sure, adapt the plan as we go forward. So can I ask, therefore, that we again note and agree this plan? I just need to check whether we need to vote on this one. So we can note it and note the recommendations. Is it something that we would like to vote on this evening? Matthew, I'm happy to vote on this one as it's a more significant.
It's entirely up to you, Chairman. It isn't necessary. You can do it by assent if you wish, but if you want to vote, that's fine.
Is there anyone who would disagree or want to abstain on this paper? Or are you happy to take it forward? We think it is as positive as we hope it to be. Yep, okay, or I see nods, and so we won't have a vote. Thank you, Matthew. We will agree that by consent with lots of nods and thumbs up. So thank you, Rosa. Thank you, Steve, for coming along. Thank you for that paper. It was very informative. And one thing I would ask, Rosa, is that we do bring that back on a year or two yearly basis. So we're looking at how the technology changes and if we can move forward any of those coloured bars and procure earlier than we expected. That would be helpful. Thank you. Okay, moving on to the next item, item 9, which is an update on the Climate Emergency Action Plan progress update from Ben. So over to you, please, Ben.
Yeah, I'll just bring up my screen again. Yeah, so me and Maggie wrote this report, so we'll be sharing the content on it. Yeah, so this is just an update on the progress on the Climate Emergency Action Plan. Since the last meeting, we said we'd do this as a regular item, so this is the first edition of that, I guess. So at the last meeting, we brought a paper about community engagement, and since then, this is just sort of summarising progress on that. So, sort of internally within staff, we've developed a draft community and staff engagement strategy, thinking about all the ways we'll engage to do with the climate emergency, and each of the different bits that make that up are going to be explained here. So, the first one, as we discussed the last meeting about a subgroup to the One Colchester Strategic Board, specifically on climate change. We've drafted a memorandum of understanding of the sort of governance and the principles and the aims and purposes of that group. We're bringing that to the next strategic board meeting in January next year to sort of come to an agreement with that, the organisations to be involved, the members from those organisations, and essentially how it will work. And the next one we've got on here is a survey, which we discussed last time, exploring sort of residents' attitudes and behaviours in relation to the climate emergency, priorities for actions that they'd like the council to do. And so since that meeting, we've made a draft list of questions that have been circulated with staff at the council for input on how those are designed. And so they're going out to staff, and they'll also be going out to the staff Speak Up Now group, which is a group that's been formed at the council of around about 30 staff, I think, to get their opinions on it. And the purpose of that Speak Up Now group is just for different people to contribute ideas to sort of how the council operates, and we thought that was quite a good way to trial it with a select member of staff. But you also talked about the last meeting, so some other methods for community engagement, so things like forums and participatory budgeting. And I've got some costs of some of those platforms if we want to talk about those, so I'll let any questions come in on that afterwards. One item that we briefly mentioned at the last meeting, I didn't want to mention too much about it because it's quite early on, but we will be getting £18,000 of grant funding from the LGA and University College London to do a engagement project with 2 schools in Colchester around increasing the environmental awareness of staff, pupils and parents through an action-based learning approach. So it will be primarily of sort of 2 phases. The first phase being like an audit kind of phase to understand what that school is already doing to reduce its environmental impact and to identify the potential for further action. And then the second phase will be an actual sort of activities phase where we do stuff to both increase environmental awareness of the students and staff within that school, and also do things actively to reduce the environmental impact there and then where we can do that. And at the end of it, what we would like to do for these two schools that are going to be involved is to produce a sort of an action plan or a strategy for them to continue to embed environmental awareness within how the school is sort of running going forward. And we'd also like it to be a sharing exercise. So afterwards, we'll be producing a toolkit for how to sort of make sort of schools more environmentally friendly based on the experiences within the project. And obviously the schools are happy to sort of share any learning with other schools as well about what they've sort of learned during the project. So yeah, I hope that'll be quite an exciting one. So that's running from January to June/July sort of 2021. And then a staff engagement challenge that we're looking to launch at the start of next year is around encouraging behaviour change to more sort of green behaviours, and about sort of sharing experiences and skills. So the idea is that a staff will pledge to do a certain environmental behaviour, take it on for like a month or so, and in return other staff will give sort of rewards in the form of sort of skills or lessons to make kind of like a fun thing, and also I think to sort of get sort of staff sort of knowing each other more a little bit. So a bit of like a fun thing. January sort of in line with sort of New Year's resolutions and things like that. So yeah, and I think I'll hand over to Maggie to cover the next few points.
Should we take questions before we move on?
We can do, if you want to do it like that, if you want to do community engagement, if there's any specific questions there.
Perhaps that might be good, since I know there was some keen interest on seeing the questions, and so I'll just.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Maggie. I did say when we had a brief on this that with the questions, it would be good to come back to us as a committee, just as a checking point, really, when the survey is produced, and we did feel that that was the right way forward. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'm not sure if you want to just address that point made about the survey and move on.
That's great, thank you. Yes, I think we will provide the process that we've gone through to date to develop the survey questions, and also provide a summary of the existing surveys and the outcomes of those, so that you've got them side by side, and you can see how we've come to the questions as a whole. So this is exciting. Moving on to Rowan House, and we've put in a bid to the public sector decarbonisation scheme to Salix Finance for 500,000 and a bit more, looking at how to retrofit the office building. And we should hear shortly. Ben's been in discussion back and forth with them to make sure he's able to clarify any of the questions that have come through. But it's, as the report says, things to reduce the carbon emissions, which we've talked about earlier. Some of them come from our assets in the buildings that we use for our own staff and housing. So this will help considerably. So some of the retrofits include changing the gas boiler, looking at increasing roof insulation and replacing light bulbs. We should hear in the new year the decision on that, and so we shall keep you all informed. We've gone through the carbon management plan, so I think we can just race through that if that's okay. And Councillor Corey, you've already spoken about that, the housing update, how it's been agreed that there's 4.4 million from the budget to be spent on the housing improvements. that again is very similar. It's looking at the retrofits needed to make sure that we're reducing our carbon emissions, looking at replacing gas boilers and installing wall insulation, and looking at the energy efficiency of 100 inefficient homes, looking at the most inefficient homes first and getting them up to a C standard. This hopefully will be, again, funded through a different decarbonisation fund, this one called the Social Housing Decarbonisation Grant from the government. And again, it's about 500,000 towards that. And we haven't heard anything as of yet, so in the new year. Moving on, thank you. With the Woodland and Biodiversity Project update, it was National Tree Week. And unfortunately, because of COVID, some of the tree planting wasn't able to take place, but this has been rescheduled, taking place on the 9th of January at Mayor's Wood. So 145 trees across the borough will be planted. So that will be a good event for the new year. And this site has been reviewed by the Colchester Natural History Society, ensuring that the tree planting takes place in a suitable location. And also the tree seed nursery at the big garden in Highwoods will be ready to use for the council in the next tree planting event. So that's a nice loop. In the briefing, moving on to the Essex Climate Action Commission, I wonder if we could just have the slide now, Gillian, that was available. Just made available to me recently, because it's just a nice slide that summarizes some of the Commission's recommendations. So this commission is an cross-party commission, and it's provided recommendations on particular themes. So adapting to an already changing climate, which is much more about disaster management and flooding response, and then transport and the built environment. And I wanted to pull out, especially to you councillors, the recommendations on the built environment, because it touches on the conversation we were having earlier around our emissions. And these are the primary recommendations that come out of that. And we agree with them in principle, but of course, as we've seen with the fleet strategy, one has to think about taking these recommendations on board very carefully in terms of the feasibility and viability in terms of the economics of it. And so the Commission will present us with a viability study around 2021, but they didn't say exactly which month. I just wanted to raise that, especially the all new homes consented to be carbon zero by 2025 is highly ambitious and will have some implications. And at the moment, it's been a good working mental exercise of what Colchester could do with these recommendations and what we might want to define in our climate emergency action plan around housing. So just wanted to flag all of that to you. Then we go on to section 5.19, Ben.
Yep.
Around the positive parking strategy.
Yeah. So this is just a quick one. At the last Environment and Sustainability panel, Richard Walker presented the positive parking strategy to you all, and that's now been formally adopted at Cabinet. Also at the last meeting, Jane Thompson mentioned about the government's active travel fund and Essex's bid into that, into tranche 2 to get further funding for active travel improvements, and that was successful. And so some of this money will be going towards implementing infrastructure improvements in Colchester, such as school streets and segregated cycle lanes. The detailed design has been worked up, involving sort of a number of different groups in Colchester, including Colchester Cycle Campaign, Walk Colchester, and the Blind and Partially Sighted group. And consultation with other stakeholders will then take place in January and February. So that's a positive for next year that will be seen. I think we mentioned the town deal bit before, but this is just to give an update that was submitted in the end of October 2020, and the council is waiting to hear back about that, whether their bid has been successful. And a number of elements of the town deal align with the climate emergency declaration, particularly around transport elements, such as installing secure cycle parking, improving cycling links with the university in Greenstead to the town centre. So that's just one to note. This one is just about a funding opportunity that the council was exploring, called the Economic Development and Active Living Fund. I'll let Maggie add a little bit more onto that if she wants to, as she's been more involved in that fund than I have. And then the last one is just about a conversation that the council's been having with a startup business at the University of Essex that focuses on electric mobility, and particularly on-demand transport solutions. So basically things like taxis where you can call them up and get them to come to you. And we're talking to them about potentially setting up, we're very early proposals about setting up an e-bike hire scheme in Colchester in partnership with the university and also with North Station as well. So that's quite early on, but just to note, that's just an example of sort of principles of the economic recovery and working with sort of local startups who are using sort of green technologies and helping them to support them basically. So yeah, that's the end of the report. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ben and Maggie, for that update. I have one question from Councillor Chinningworth. So Peter, over to you first.
Yes, thank you. Ben and Maggie, thank you very much for that. I'd like a little bit more explanation about this Climate Change Commission. It is a political body, is it? Composed of councillors, or is it more of a technical body? And also, who are they aiming their advice to? Is it local authorities, or is it businesses? Is it the whole community? I'm not sure from your report, any of that. It concerns me that they're making long-term recommendations like carbon neutral housing by 2025, when building regulations haven't yet been altered, and also that 2/3 of existing homes will be dealt with as well. It seems extraordinary that they're making these recommendations, which can only happen if there's government support and policy change or government money. The third point is, what are school streets, which are mentioned? I've no idea. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'll just pick up a couple of the points, but go for more detail from the officers. So the commission, I think, was started up, was instigated by the county council as a bit of a political committee, which similar to this, I would say, I think for the county council. I think it took a while before it actually met, but now it's got going, and these are its recommendations. And I very much agree with your points. I mean, they're noble aims, and I want to absolutely help deliver those. But we do need change from the building regulations from national government, change in legislation, and in terms of other changes, we need the private sector on board as well. So we do need to. I would want to support the commission, but I think your questions about what it is, what it's doing, if the officers could help with that, and school streets is something, yes, I've heard about from Kevin Bentley and others, and Robert Mitchell at the County Council. But again, officers, if you could say a bit more about that, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to come in there. Yeah, so the Climate Action Commission is made up of mainly councillors, but does include a couple of business members as well. I don't know who they are, but I just know there's a couple on there. And the main idea is that officers within Essex County Council, but also from collaboration with experts, have helped to come up with the recommendations, which are then, or the ideas that are then proposed to the commission. So that's the councillors involved, who then approve the recommendations going forward. They've got a number of different focus groups, and I think built environment and energy and waste, and I think transport have been done. I think there's a couple more that have been done in the new year. So the report we've received is an interim report. I think built environment was one of the first ones that they had the focus group on, hence why we've got information on that so far. And then in regard to the school streets, basically, I think they can vary, but it's basically the idea of implementing changes to streets between school times, between school drop-off and school pick-up times, that basically promote walking, cycling, scooting, anything like that, kind of like active travel, to make that easier, rather than dropping sort of students off by car. That's basically what they're doing, like promoting that sort of thing. And the school streets for Colchester are mainly looking along Lexton Road and picking up the schools along there, and also some of the Norman Way secondary schools as well.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mandy, please, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, Ben's done a very good job of describing what the Essex Climate Action Commission is. And I think it's, you know, it's business people, but it's academics as well as councillors. So it's a very broad, a broad church, if you like. And I think there's Young Essex Assembly in there too. So I think there's quite a few young people. I think the reason that we're bringing it is not necessarily to, you know, to either sign up to it or not sign up to it, but just to use it as an example of what's going on in the area in relation to climate change, and in relation to our sort of environment and sustainability strategies. So that was that one. I think in relation to the school streets, Ben's done a really good job of trying to sort of conceptualise them and make them practical, but they are basically a range of measures that will offer the ability to reduce pollution, improve air quality, provide better safety, and promote active travel and healthier lifestyles outside schools. So that could be traffic calming measures, it could be reduction in speed, those kinds of things. It could be stopping cars entirely. So it depends on the area, and it depends on how that's going to be implemented in each area. I hope that helps.
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
One thing I'm not totally clear on is whether or not the county council have put in their tranche 2 application with those schools already outlined, or whether we can add to that list with sort of a bit of lobbying about our schools that we think have got a serious problem, which most of them have, unfortunately, with lots of car drivers going there. Okay, Mandy, did you want to come back? Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, we have got the school streets in the town deal. So we have got some of the school streets already in the town deal, and there is a significant investment in transport related, I suppose, transport related areas that relate to this kind of strategy in the town deal. So I sort of totted up, we'd put in something like 7.8 million, I think it was, for transport related active travel type of projects. And now, of course, we don't know whether we're going to get that, but we should hear, I am hoping, at the end of January, around about then. So there's a significant amount in that. And I think the comments from earlier around 28% of those kind of emissions, and I think it was, what was it, 28% of greenhouse gases were to do with transport. I think it's, you know, that kind of thing could have a real impact.
Thank you, Mandy. Okay, I see no other questions on this paper. It is an update across the board. I did just write down a couple of things. School streets has been discussed. The Woodland project, we have We have evolved that over time, as you have heard from me before, to ensure that we're not just looking at tree planting. It is about biodiversity and increasing biodiversity, and not making errors of monoculture with tree planting. And I'm really pleased to hear about the Highwoods seed nursery. I think it's a really good idea. I think we should expand that as much as we can. And I will take some criticism is when we plant some of these trees and we use volunteers, which is about engagement. Some of them do not survive, and we got some criticism. I think some of us as councillors were there at the Spring Lane, one of the first big developments in planting trees, and we need to take that criticism and learn and move on. So I know, Ben, you're not directly responsible for that. That's Nick Day as an officer, and we are listening and working with the Natural History Society as well, taking on board their comments. So I think it's a step-by-step approach where we learn as we go about the best way to green our borough, but also as politicians, the best way to engage the public on it as well, which we're trying to do. Okay, the last point was about the built environment, but Peter had already raised that, so I've extinguished my questions. I don't see any other people willing to speak on this, so can we again agree this paper? Thank you for the update, and note it, please, committee. Thank you. I see lots of nods. Excellent. We'll move on then to the work programme, the last item of the evening, which is item 10. So the work programme going forward, Matthew, I will go to you just to report what we've got in the coming agenda items, please.
Thank you, Chair. Members, the only main changes to note to the work programme has already been covered this evening, the addition of a standing item on progress update in relation to the Climate Emergency Action Plan. And the only other change that's happened is the moving of the report on the Environmental Sustainability Strategy, which was due to come to this meeting, into the January meeting. So you'll get that then. But other than that, if you're happy, that's the only comments I'd make on the work programme at this stage.
Thank you, Matthew. Do think, members, if there's anything else you want to put on, and I know when we have our briefings, you will do that. Mandy, I just thought we had a brief discussion earlier this morning, just about the discussion we had at a briefing about strategy and action plan. And I want to be absolutely clear that some of our climate action plan to date has been quite strategic. We need to make sure it's clear and deliverable, and an action plan is an action plan. And I think when we look at strategy, we need to be clear what our strategy is going forward. So I do think there's a piece of work to pull apart what is our environment and sustainability strategy and what is our action plan. And I do feel that you were putting to me that that was going to be done. Will that be done, ready for the new year, Mandy?
What I think we need to do is, at the moment, just to explain to members, and I think you started to explain it, is we've got this environmental sustainability strategy, our climate emergency action plan, and one possible approach to that is to extract all of the strategic bits out of the climate emergency action plan, and put them with the other pieces of the environmental sustainability strategy. Because at the moment, the climate emergency action plan is both strategic and has some very concrete actions. And I think we need to sort of look at where we can have an overarching strategy, be that a combination of the environmental and sustainability strategy and the strategic elements of the climate emergency action plan. And then underneath that strategic document, because there is overlap between those, but underneath that strategic document, we have an action plan or plans underneath that are concrete and measurable. So that links very much to the conversation we had earlier around measurability and attaching measures and indicators of success where we can. So it gives real visibility of that action plan linked to that strategy, and we can then measure those. And where they're more qualitative, instead of sort of measuring them in a kind of indicator-based way, we measure that as progress, or we have targets or milestones associated with that. So what we are suggesting that we do is we go back and we look at both of those documents and we lay down that approach and lay that out in detail where the sections are going to be. So while we may not have that finished at that point, we will have a very good idea of what that will look like for members to consider. It's really just reassessing the framework of this programme of work, I think.
Yep, thank you, Manny. It makes sense to me, and I think I see nods from elsewhere. We need to make sure we've got the action plan separate to strategic goals, really, and they do work hand in hand. I did see Councillor Scordis's hand up, but I assume it was either an accident or your question was answered in that conversation. Okay, thank you. I see no other hands up, so are we happy to agree the work programme going forward? Yep, nods again, thank you, and thumbs up, excellent. Well, that concludes, if I'm not wrong, the agenda items. So thank you. Yep, that does. Matthew, you're happy. We've agreed that work programme going forward. Thank you all for attending this evening. Thank you to the substitutes. Thank you, officers, as always. And we'll see you soon. Have a happy Christmas and a new year, and ensure that you reduce your carbon footprint this Christmas.
Thank you. Good night, all.